You're listening to the Modern People Leader podcast. Today's episode will be a part of our People Leader series, where we go behind the scenes with today's top HR leaders and talk to them about how they've gotten to where they're at and what they really do every day. Hope you enjoy. Melanie, welcome to the Modern People Leader. How you doing?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I don't know why it still feels like a Monday to me, but I feel like this is me officially starting my week, like getting into the swing of things, and there's no better way than, to start the week with the recording. So we're very happy to have you with us today. So we start every episode the exact same way, and that's with something we call good news stories. So we all go around and share something from the last week or two. Could be work related, could be personal, just anything that comes to mind. And we like for our guests to go first. So if you're ready, we prefer you to go. But if you need some time, we can jump in.
No, I'm happy to. Okay, so this will be a personal good news story, a couple. First, my son, who's 10 months, just started crawling. So we're really excited because, well, he's 10 months old. So, we thought maybe, it was like delayed or is he just going to walk? But anyway, he started crawling. So we're really pleased and he's very excited to be mobile. And I guess the second one, my 2.5-year-old daughter recently has been jumping into the pool on her own from the side of the pool. So she's been in swimming lessons for a really long time. So this is a huge milestone for us. And it's great. She went in, eyes wide open, and when her face emerged from the water, she was just smiling ear to ear. So we're psyched.
Oh
Steven,
my
you going to
God,
go
that's so
next?
cute. Yeah, that's so cute. I remember those days. My daughter could not swim continuously. Like she was just like super fearful of that. And there is like a lot of swimming pools in Austin in an area called Barton Creek. And she learned there because she could go from like rock to rock. And that was like her way of feeling good. And then she had the courage. She was like, "Oh, I can do this." So congrats. That is a cool milestone. I'm gonna do like a combo deal. So mine is both work and personal. I worked remotely from Amsterdam for the last 2 weeks, and it was my fiance was there for legitimate, like for actual work purposes. I just kind of tagged along, and it's part of this entrepreneurial lifestyle. There's a lot of risk, but there are some rewards. And my goal was to like lean into the benefits of this lifestyle a little more this time around. Because the last journey I just exited, that was not the case. So Amsterdam was great. I was super productive. I got, most of my consulting work done in week one. And so week two, I just blasted my LinkedIn and asked the Modern People Leader community to tell me who to meet with. And it was like Friday evening at 5 p.m. Amsterdam time. And my first meeting the next week was at like 9 a.m. And so it was just a really cool, just to see the power of the Modern People Leader at work. So thank you, community. Thank you, listeners. And super impressed with HR space in Amsterdam. They're doing some cool things.
I was going to go with a
Daniel?
similar good news story about all of because I've been on like this travel marathon. So I've already gone on like 4 trips in the last couple months. Some work, some for fun, but I think I'm gonna switch it up. So we've been doing the podcast for 3.5 years, and for those 3.5 years, I've done almost all of the editing myself, which can be fun, but it can also be a bit of it holds us back a bit in terms of like what we can do as a business because there are more value adding things that I could be doing. And it's looking like we're putting together a plan to fully outsource all of the editing, which will be huge. I love editing, but I'm excited to hand it off to somebody else. Hey everyone, we've got one last good news story for you. We are thrilled to announce our first ever live in-person podcast. Mark your calendars for September 17th in Austin, Texas. The topics will be rethinking performance management, distributed work, and the impact of AI. And we've got some amazing guests lined up. So far, we've got Jonna Driver, the new Chief People Officer at Lattice, David Hanrahan, Chief People Officer at Flare, Jessica's one, author of Built for People and the COO at Talentful. And then we've got 2 hours dedicated to networking and just hanging out with fellow HR leaders. Tickets are on sale for $249, but we have a special treat for our podcast listeners. Use our exclusive discount code MPL-Live-50 and snag your ticket for just under $125. Whether you're an ATX HR leader or planning to make the trip, don't miss out. So if this sounds like something that you want to check out, the link to register is in the show notes. And this is just the beginning. We plan to host these events every quarter in different cities. So if you don't live in Austin, who knows, maybe the next city we visit will be your city. So yeah, grab your tickets today and we'll see you in Austin.
Sales are better. Growing the business is better. Trust me. Well, that is great news. That is great news. And so, Melanie, today's all about you. And I call the next question our Brene Brown question. Tell us your story. Tell us about the journey you've been on and how that led to you becoming Chief People Officer at Dropbox.
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, we'll go way back. My undergraduate degree is actually in finance. And my first job out of college was in a finance rotational development program at Gillette, the razor blade manufacturing company in Boston. I found out pretty quickly after staring at Excel for a few weeks that this was definitely not the right role or function for me. But I ended up attending some career fairs at local Boston universities to recruit for new participants for the program. And I really fell in love with recruiting in the HR space, and I couldn't believe people actually got paid to do this work. And so I still spent a few years in finance, but in order to pivot, ended up taking a role as a compensation analyst in HR at a company called Iron Mountain. They interestingly stored like paper files versus digital files. So eventually, though, I became interested in the HR business partner space and took a role at GE, supporting one of their hardware and software businesses. Really, really loved tech. And I thought if I love the tech space, I should think about the Bay Area. And so I moved to San Francisco to work for Apple, which was an incredible experience. And through my network, I met this woman named Arden Hoffman, who at the time was Dropbox's first head of people. And she was just building out the people team, and she recruited me to lead the HR business partner team. So this is a huge opportunity. I had never managed anyone before. I had never grown a team before. So I was really excited. And then, a couple of years into that, there was sort of a pivotal moment where our head of learning and development left the company. And then Arden said, hey, there are a lot of companies that are sort of combining their HR business partner and learning and dev team. So why don't you take this team too? And I went home and I thought about it, and I wrote up this list of pros and cons as to why I would be the right leader or would not be the right leader. And the cons list was much longer. And then I gave it to her, and she basically said, I don't buy any of this. You can do this. Just go build out this team. And so I did. And that gave me a lot of confidence for, the next time we had some turnover on the HR leadership team, I would sort of take that team on, if even in the interim, help hire a leader, and so on. And so because I ended up amassing some breadth just through taking those sort of lateral interim roles, it really prepared me for the CPO role when Arden moved on.
And so I feel like, oh, you're going to say something, Steven?
No, I was just going to say that we were sharing connections we have with former colleagues. I worked with Arden at Goldman Sachs. She was in diversity and inclusion back then.
That's
and
right.
And so I don't know her personally well, but I know of her because it was a 4-year overlap in the early or the mid knots.
Yeah,
So
what a small world.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like this HR world is so small. I think everybody knows everybody. I feel like most people know what Dropbox does, but for those that, for the 1% of people that have never heard of Dropbox, how would you describe to them what y'all do?
Yeah, great question. So I would describe it as we enable individuals, teams, and companies to store, search, organize, and share your stuff with anyone, right, through the cloud. So this might be for an insurance agent who is saving photos of flood damage, to a director with a feature at the Sundance Film Festival who is using Dropbox to edit and share.
And so, Melanie, why should we be jealous that you get to work for Dropbox?
Yeah, so let's see, where do we even begin? I've been here for almost a decade. So I can give you maybe three reasons. So the first is we are a virtual first company where remote work is the primary experience for our employees, but we still prioritize in-person connection for our teams at least quarterly. Virtual first is a unique operating model that has sort of upended the traditional ideas of where and how we work. So we believe that flexibility and agency are actually the ultimate currencies in modern work, and we've been able to enable our employees to do their best work and be their most productive selves in a way that we believe office and hybrid settings cannot. So that would be the first, is around virtual first. The next would be just people and culture. So in my almost decade here, I've met with countless employees who are just joining, as well as those who are departing. And what seals the deal for candidates and what they say most often is that it's due to the really smart people that they meet who are genuinely good human beings. And when employees leave, they'll cite the people and culture as the number one things they'll miss. And in fact, over the course of the last maybe 2 years, we've had well over 100 boomerangs. So boomerangs are folks that leave our company and then return within a year, right? So pretty telling. And then the third piece really is it's all about impact here. So because of our culture and our teammates and the way we work, we truly strive to enable our employees to have the greatest impact of their careers, right? And effectively your own gatekeeper of success here.
I feel like every company should have a metric for boomerangs. I think a lot of companies know that they have boomerangs, but they don't know the exact number. I feel like that's a really good indicator that people have a good experience when they're at Dropbox. And I also feel like it speaks to this virtual first model that y'all have moved to. And my next question was, why does Dropbox believe in virtual first and not enforcing RTO mandates or anything like that? I feel like you kind of just answered it, but like, why do you think that flexibility is so crucial for the organization?
Yeah, thank you. You're right that a lot of companies are mandating this return to office, either full time or in some sort of hybrid model, and often they cite collaboration and culture, right, or as the main drivers for that callback. And we really believe the conversation should change, right? It really should be less about where you work and more about how you work. Like observed busyness is not actually the same thing as value creation. And just on the topic of collaboration and culture, Dropbox recently won Best Tech Company for Culture and Values by Glassdoor, and we did so as a completely remote company. So I don't really buy that great cultures require being tethered to a specific location or building. We have found, and I think we'll get into this, right, into statistics and proof points and that type of thing, but when you give employees agency over where and how they work, they outperform, they're generally happier, and they're more likely to stay at the company.
And so, tell us a little bit about what you've learned around what it takes to be successful in this working model. And so, how more specifically, like how do you set up your employees for success? Like what are the most critical things to ensure that everyone's kind of operating in flow or kind of their prime state?
Yeah, this is a great question because I think it's one thing to declare what type of future of work model or working model you have, but it's another to really invest in how you bring whatever model you choose to life. And so, first, it's really about the psychology around work, right? And sort of changing mindsets around how we work. So, for example, one of the things that we did was we went async by default. So, thinking twice before reflexively scheduling meetings for everything. And we supported our employees with trainings on things like writing with brevity, since so much of our communication and decision making is done asynchronously in a remote environment. We double down on proper meeting hygiene, limiting it to what we call the 3Ds. So discussion, debate, or decision making. We adopted a practice around core collaboration hours. So these are meeting windows that overlap by time zones. So on the West Coast, this would be like 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. and on the East Coast, 12 to 4. We're also committed to evolving virtual first using the same process we use for product development. So we're building and testing and iterating and kind of always changing and improving the model. There's a first kind of like this big chunk of changing mindsets and changing your psychology around work. But next is around reimagining supporting a remote workforce, right? A few things that we did here. The first is we revised what we call our perks program. So, given that our employees no longer will reap the benefits of in office perks, and we had many, uh, we give out a stipend for employees to invest in whatever perk is most important to them. So, this could be childcare, gym membership, even individual office space should their home not be adequate for remote work. We also established something called Dropbox neighborhoods. So this is where employees who are co-located in or around the same city can come together. And they come together for things like, happy hours, but also all hands watch parties or product releases or demos, that type of thing. We also pivoted from fixed office space and we're investing in an on-demand meeting space strategy, right? So we partner with a third party called Gable. It's like a meeting space aggregator. So anywhere in the world you can book meeting space. And we also have an open source virtual first toolkit. So this has frameworks and best practices for some of the things I mentioned around running effective meetings, but also things like cultivating teamwork. And the purpose of this was sharing what we're learning and the tools that we're leveraging with other companies that are embracing a similar style of work. And we publish everything, right? So we do a virtual first annual report. We have partnered with Gartner, The Economist, and most recently HBR on just like studying remote work, right? And kind of the cost of distraction at work and why we believe this model is kind of the best of all worlds. And the last point I'll touch on really is we've doubled down on the art of gathering. So virtual first is not virtual only, right? It really is central to the virtual first experience. And it builds the necessary foundation of trust that's required, right? We know that in-person connection is really important to building high-performing teams and solving complex problems. I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but we do encourage teams together at least once a quarter.
So we just published an episode today actually with Nick Bloom, who
Mm,
I'm sure you're familiar with Nick
yes.
Bloom. He's like one of like the three or four people in this space that everybody sort of listens to as one of the sources of truth. And yeah, you hit on pretty much everything that we talked about with him. So one thing that you did mention was supporting employees with trainings on things like writing with brevity. And I know this is something that I probably struggle with because when you do work async, you want to include more details than less. And while that is well intentioned, I think a lot of times people just decide not to read it. I'm kind of like discovering this with, like the main way we make money is through sponsorships. And there's a lot of back and forth async work with us and our sponsors. And I like default to oversharing. So just selfishly, I'm curious, like, what were some of the tips in that training on writing with brevity?
I think the first is like don't bury the lead, right? Just get to the point as soon as possible. We often will have like a TLDR or an exec summary at the top of every single document. So if you can only read for like 2 minutes, you will get everything that you need to get in that blurb, right? I think the other thing that's really helpful may not be as applicable to your use case, but this notion of getting a lot of stakeholder buy-in before you're shipping something, right, is generally helpful in sort of accelerating the decision making process. But the other thing that we do is if we are meeting and there is a document, and ideally people will have pre read it, we are going to make the assumption that they haven't. So every meeting starts with like a 5 minute pre read. So you can just, everybody is kind of grounded and has like a refresh on what we're about to talk about. So there are a couple of practices. We stole that last one from Amazon. But yeah, I don't know if this is helpful at all. I'm happy to send you our toolkit.
No, that's definitely helpful. And I think you're describing some of the challenges that I've been having because a lot of our sponsors are smaller teams or they were smaller teams. And now we've sort of graduated to much bigger companies. And with much bigger companies comes much bigger teams. And there's a lot going on and there's more stakeholders involved. And I think your tip on, getting stakeholder buy-in early on, I could have used that tip maybe like 2 months ago.
What's really helpful too is if you lead with data, like data, trends, insights, it really helps bring whatever story right to life in a very clear and objective way.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up data because that's a perfect segue to my next question. And earlier you mentioned that every year you issue a report. So I'm guessing you have like a research arm It's helping compile metrics, probably doing some external research and maybe tapping into your pulse surveys or your employee listening strategy. So can you share some data with us? Like what are some of the key insights that you have generated through this, your research lab?
Do you ever wonder what it means to be a great place to work? Like, what does that even mean? Well, Great Place to Work has cracked the code, hence the name. After 30 years of research and insights from 100 million employees worldwide, they've been able to set the gold standard with their Great Place to Work model. The model pinpoints the experiences and leadership behaviors that boost business success. So if you're curious, whether your people think that your company makes the cut, then I highly recommend joining the 21,000 other companies that have gone through this process and taken the Trust Index survey. It really is the quickest way to figure out whether you're truly a great place to work. And through the data they provide you, you can also find ways to improve things like the employee experience, retention, and productivity. And who knows, depending on what your survey results reveal, your company might just land on one of their best workplaces lists. So if you want to learn more, go to greatplacetowork.com/MPL. That's greatplacetowork.com/MPL.
Yeah, so I think first with hiring, because we're no longer tethered to specific high cost cities, we're able to acquire talent from all over. So we went from an office centric workforce with 97% of our employees working in offices across just 10 locations to a totally globally distributed workforce with only 50% of our employees located in those higher cost cities. And so some interesting stats here on recruiting. Over 70% of our new hires actually cite virtual first as the reason for their interest in Dropbox, which is huge, right? Huge top of funnel driver. Our offer accept rates are almost in the 90s, right? Whereas the industry offer accepts are more like 70, 75%. So this is our highest on record. Our time to hire is at record lows, so something like 40 days against an industry average of 60, right? Which just speaks to the efficiencies that we've gained now that we are able to kind of expand the talent pool, right? On the retention side, I guess retention and engagement, in Virtual First, we saw the highest employee engagement scores that we've ever seen as a company. We've also seen last year the lowest attrition rates we've ever seen as a company. So in something like 16, 17 years, lowest. In some of our surveys, we ask, why employees continue to choose Dropbox. Virtual First is the number one driver. And the vast majority say that Virtual First helps them work more effectively than they would in an office. So tons of great stats here. I think the other, we've recently been looking at something we're calling quality of hire. So this is a blend of performance, retention, and engagement. And we looked at quality of hire pre-Virtual First and then post. And since we've gone Virtual First, our quality of hire has increased every year. So pretty compelling stats. Again, still early days, right? We're like 3 years in, but very, very exciting momentum.
That is most definitely going to be a clip from this episode. So one thing that you mentioned earlier, I'm gonna get the name of the list wrong. I think you said maybe like Glassdoor's like
Yeah,
best cultures or
best,
something like
yeah,
that.
tech and val, yeah.
Yeah, and
Best tech company for culture and values.
and to your point, I think a lot of times when people think of culture, they think of that culture being built in person. And I know we are going to talk about in-person gatherings and how that's part of the strategy. But when you think about the overall culture of Dropbox and why people feel like it's such a great culture, I'm sure it's more than just the in-person gatherings. I'm sure it's all of the little moments across the entire employee experience. I'm curious, like, what have been some of the biggest learnings the past few years since making this shift? What are some of like the most critical moments in making sure that you're delivering a good experience and a good culture?
It starts with trust, always, right? So when you sort of double down on remote work, what you are saying is, we trust you to deliver on the things that you say you're going to. And we don't need to walk by your desk. We don't have to physically observe you. We trust, right? We're all setting the right super assertive goals together and we're holding each other accountable, but we trust you to deliver. So I think that is number one. And I think the other is when you give employees agency over their schedules. So we touched on some things like core collaboration hours, which are 4-hour meeting windows. it means that the rest of that time is yours, right? And we trust that you're going to use it in the right way. And some of this is to do deep work, or you can check email, however you want to spend that time. It's really important that it is your time, right? And that agency is also, I think, really central to our culture. I think the other thing too is we build with our employees, right? So this stuff is not just like done in a vacuum and then we roll it out and like hope for the best, right? We do a lot of pilots with lots of teams. We engage employees from every function, every team at every level of the organization to help us build this thing and to help us continue to iterate and make it better. And not only that, but we do publish, right? Where we've gotten it wrong as well. So folks know that their input is used not only on how to make it better, but to reflect on what hasn't worked and why. So I think those are some of the things that we've learned and that have kind of like accelerated, I think, our culture in a virtual first world.
And I'm just curious,
Go
you
ahead,
say
Tyndall.
that, you talk about the times that you've gotten it wrong.
Yeah,
Is there one specific example that comes to mind?
definitely. So this probably will sound familiar to you and most, but establishing boundaries with remote work is really hard because the hours blur together, right? And then sometimes you actually end up working much longer hours than you previously would in an office. So we need to be really mindful about burnout. And I think in the same vein, satisfaction with things like physical movement is extremely low. You don't have to get up and walk, right, to another conference room or travel to, another meeting location. And so that is really important to pay attention to that end. We just did something called a meet and move pilot. So we encouraged a group of folks to take meetings on the phone while walking versus Zoom. And our satisfaction with physical movement actually doubled to something like over 80% for those pilot participants. So I would say burnout, movement, those types of things are always things you need to pay attention to with remote work.
Daniel and I both like everything you are saying totally resonates because we have to be really intentional about, obviously this is much smaller scale because it's just the two of us, but it is difficult to, those lines do become blurry between your personal life because it's like, it's not work-life balance, it's work-life integration. And I've signed up for that. Like that's what I want. We were on a podcast with Hiba Yusuf. It was like a crossover pod. She asked the question, like, what is the one thing if your employer told you like this new policy or this is a new way, what would result in you quitting? And my response was return to office. If my employer told me I had to go to an office to work and like be constrained by that, like I would quit and find another job. And so like I totally relate to that, to your last response. But I want to go back to core collaboration because I feel like collaboration also gets a bad rap within the kind of remote working construct. And so my feeling is that there is a misperception that you can't collaborate well within kind of a remote first working model. And so tell us a little bit about the positive impacts tell us a little bit more about the policy, how you defined it, how you continue to maintain it. Because to me, finding these kind of set times where we know we can rely on being able to connect and collaborate with our team members is super, super crucial. It's also one of the areas where I think a lot of companies have failed. And so tell us a little bit more about kind of how you got to what your policy is. And again, some of the critical success factors, some of your lessons learned.
Yeah, so the way when you pivot to remote work, you can't just take the things that you did in the office and then just like move it to a virtual context. It doesn't work. And I would argue that when you were sitting in the office for 8 straight hours a day of meetings, that was also broken. And so we did not want to take that broken practice and then like move it to a virtual world, right? So it started with, principally speaking, what do we want our workdays to look like? We don't want it to look like the virtual version of being in an office, right? And so we really thought about this notion of like overlapping windows of time because so much of our work is cross-functional and even global in nature, right? And so to the extent that we can accomplish that and set this time and it's a standard that everyone in the company follows, it makes it much easier just to get the basics right of like booking time with the right people. But collaboration is also about behavior, right? And I think, I know I talked about this before, but when you have a trusted working relationship, it makes collaboration work more seamlessly, right? Because you're no longer worried about, oh, if I say this thing, is this person going to get offended? Because you have trust with that person. So no, they're not going to get offended, right? But it takes time. And that's why sort of, and I know we'll talk about gathering, but this gathering piece of working on that relationship building is critical to then when you are working virtually trying to collaborate right remotely and asynchronously. So there's a structural element, but there's also sort of a behavioral piece.
Yeah, I feel like that's the perfect segue into in-person gatherings. Can you explain at what point, or share the story of at what point you realized that this would be something that would be very important to think more about? And yeah, I'll just stop there. Like, when was the point when Dropbox is like, you know what? In-person gatherings actually do make a big impact, and we need to figure this out.
Immediately. So one of our principles was around the importance of gathering for team building. There is no replacement for that. So anything that we did needed to be able to facilitate this. And then it came down to, but what's the right cadence, right? And then how do we do this? Keep in mind when we adopted virtual first, we were still in the pandemic. So then this sort of the demand for wanting to gather just continued to increase because people hadn't been able to do it for so long, right? So I think it was sort of a principle from the beginning. And then now that we've had a couple of years of gathering under our belt, what we've learned is we have to up our game in terms of the quality of gathering and our goals in coming together and just continuously learning on what makes like a best or a better in-person experience. We've done a ton of research on the ROI of gathering, and so I can share a couple stats. 80% of our employees have rated in-person gathering as critical for team effectiveness and also feeling a stronger connection to the company and culture. The top 3 business outcomes that our employees are reporting are learning something new together. It's the first one. The second is the increase in information flow, so the team's ability to share relevant information effectively. And the third is around aligning on future plans. So getting together in person actually accelerates these 3 things. And we've also learned that the ideal gathering frequency is 4 times a year. And this is as it pertains to team cohesion and inclusion and belonging. And you tend to have diminishing returns after 6 times a year. This is where we see workload, right, become imbalanced, execution scores start to decrease. And so we've been studying this, right, over time to really understand what the right frequency is. And we'll continue to tinker with it and things could change over time. But I think it's important to continue to measure it. So these are a couple of things that we've learned so far.
Hearing you reminded me of our interview with Annie Dean at Atlassian. And
Atlassian, yeah.
And I believe you may have partnered with her or brought her in to talk to your leadership team at some point. But we love Annie, love what Atlassian's doing. A lot of similarities in the journeys, I think, that your 2 organizations have had. And
Yes.
one of the things that I remember her pointing out that just still sticks with me is a metric around the impact, the sustained impact an in-person gathering has, and the length of time, that the lagging effect, the positive lagging effect that has. And that, to me, coupled with your stat on the diminishing returns, is like, if I were a people leader, I would like that's trying to fight for keeping a remote first working model. Like, those would be 2 things that I absolutely latch onto, because and of course there are a lot of other things to wrap into that business case, but those 2 things alone, like, it just like really stick with me. And it's just it seems so obvious, but yet it's still a hotly debated topic right now. So thank you for sharing. Our audience is super data hungry, and so those insights are amazing. And so, gathering, one of the modes that or one of the ways that you're bringing your people together is through offsites. And I feel like the offsite is like having a renaissance of sorts. Like, I remember old school, like, offsites were a really big thing. Then they became like boondoggles, and it's like, wait a second, you're paying all of these people to go offsite, and now it's just like, it's back. Offsites are back.
It is back,
And
yes.
so Tell us a little bit about the magic of a Dropbox offsite. What sort of guidance that you're providing leaders and senior managers? What does this look like? It's a great tool in the remote working arsenal. So just share with us a little bit about how they work at Dropbox.
So we have sort of a number of different offsite modalities that we recommend depending on the goal of the gathering. So far we have three, and that could change over time. But if the goals are strategic in nature, so think about annual planning or innovation brainstorming, multi-year, right? Thinking and planning. We recommend what we call intact team offsites, pretty traditional, right? And your agenda is basically around planning and thinking about the future. If the goals are more tactical in nature, right? So work that requires tight, often cross-functional collaboration and execution on something urgent. So think like a bug bash before a product release. We call that type of gathering an anchor week, right? And then finally, if the goal is simply team cohesion and bonding, we're experimenting with something that we call retreats. So these are highly curated, more experiential gatherings focused on deep team bonding and professional development and community. So we have those three modalities. In order to support leaders as they're trying to figure out which of these do I use and how do I even pull this together, we have some supporting structures, right, that we have in place. So the first is we have an offsite planning team. So think of this as concierge support to address the end-to-end offsite experience. So everything from booking event space and meals and activities to content design and facilitation, recommendations on guest speakers, team effectiveness tools, right, the whole thing. We also have what we call Offsite in a Box, which is more of like a self-serve option. So these are location-specific playbooks that include where to book accommodations or event space or restaurants based on the location that you're choosing, in addition to facilitation guides, depending on the goal, right, for your offsite. So this is a couple things that we're doing. And again, this is still very much a newer space for us. So we're learning and iterating. But these are a couple of things that we're doing today to support offsites and make it a little bit more manageable. If you're, an accounting manager, you're probably not also an event planner. So you need tools and help, right, to do this.
I love the structure that you're putting in place for these in-person gatherings. So, what I've gathered so far is that Dropbox has found that 4 in-person gatherings per year is the optimal amount. You now have these 3 different modalities. So you said that you have, the traditional offsites where you're with everybody together for planning. You have these anchor weeks where you're doing things like bug bashes. And then you have retreats where, the goal is team cohesion. So what's like the right mix? Is it one, like, which one are you doing twice? I guess is the question.
So it depends on the team. So if you are an engineering team, you're probably going to do more anchor weeks over time because you're doing the bug bashing, you're getting ready for these product releases, etc. It also probably depends on the kind of where your team is in its phase of life. So if it's a newly forming team, retreats are great, right? Because your team is still sort of forming. So that's really important. And the strategic meetings, those tend to happen for everyone at a certain point in the year, no matter what. And so it does largely depend on the makeup of your team, which function you're in, that type of thing. And I think everyone is experimenting with finding the right balance of which to use and when. But it probably is not the same formula every single year, right? We want to maintain some flexibility based on what you need.
I love that there is a degree of autonomy, but there's also this kind of centralized support function, this concierge service. I feel like that's pretty important. My fiance works at a 12,000 employee company, and they also have an offsite policy, although I don't think it's as clear. And I know she is part of a remote working, like, ERG, or like I don't know if they call it an ERG, but it's like a
The
group. It's like
community.
all the community of all the remote workers, and so she is part of the Texas group, and so they have autonomy and they have budget, but oftentimes it's like it's a lot of work, right? To your point, and an accountant, or certain roles do or not, certain people just aren't going to be great at event planning, and so being able to rely on a team or some individuals to make that happen, given the critical importance, it has to be a game changer. I have to believe that's one of the most widely used services that the HR team has.
Yes, over 95% of offsites in the course of the last year were actually planned through this team. So tons of utility there. And of course, the more we learn, the better we get at making these recommendations. We're understanding kind of like which segments work, which don't, right? So for example, we have found that when we bring in external guest speakers to any offsite, the results tend to be mixed, right? And you wouldn't have thought that before, but the data is showing us that that's actually the case. When teams can come together to solve actual business problems, massively like off the charts, right, rated, right, really high. And so over time, as you test these different things, now you can make recommendations on the highest impact segments that you can use in designing your offsite.
One thing I've heard you say over and over through this podcast is, or a few words that I've heard you say over and over: test, experiment. It sounds like y'all are always playing around, tweaking, and thinking about like what's next. So I'm curious, like what's the next experiment on the roadmap? Is there anything that's on the roadmap? Yeah, what's next?
That you can share, of course.
Yeah, and if you can't share, we can cut this out.
Yeah, so I think it's sort of understanding that no one really knows what the future of work is. So continuing to just be really open-minded and learn not only from what we're doing at Dropbox, but from like all of these other companies that are experimenting with various modalities and ways of working, right? So it's just kind of keeping an open mind. It's just the principle, right, that we're all working with. Obviously, you guys might roll your eyes. Obviously, AI will have a role to play, right, in the future of work. I won't belabor that point because I'm sure everyone has talked about that. So I think that's a big piece of it. But really, I think the more companies that embrace this notion of flexibility, right, as the ultimate currency, I think the business results will show, right, that it actually is superior. But we need to do a better job, all of us, in measuring success. So if you're going to demand a return to office, how are you measuring that that's better and in what ways, right? And I think lots of companies are making like declarative statements on what is right, but the proof points really are in the data and the insights. And the more that we can publish and share with each other, I think that's sort of like rising tide lifts all boats. We can kind of all learn from each other.
So you left the breadcrumb, and I'm going to take it.
Okay.
AI. Let's talk a little bit since you brought it up. I'm just curious. Daniel knows I'm like super passionate about AI for HR. If you follow me on LinkedIn, like my personal audience knows that this is like something that I'm really passionate about. I'm just curious, like where would you say you are on the AI for HR journey? If you're at the point where you feel like you have a strategy, anything that you can share with us around like how you've gotten to where you're at in terms of looking at AI and the HR function or just the workplace more broadly, we would love to hear because we know like HR leaders, I threw a summit in Austin in March and I threw with a good friend Q Hamarani another summit in Lisbon in April. And one of the key findings was that there's still a lack of clarity, no clear path forward on AI for a lot of organizations. And so we every now and then we talk to someone who has a lot of clarity. And so I'm just curious, where are you guys on that journey?
I'm not sure if I'll be one of those people that has a lot of clarity, but I will share with you the current thinking and point of view. So I think there are two things, right? I think a lot of tech companies are embracing this notion of becoming AI first, like all of them. So there is a job for HR to do in terms of increasing the AI fluency across the entire organization. So not just engineers learning this skill, but everyone learning about AI and how it enhances their particular role or function, right? So there's that piece, and that's like a big kind of learning and development strategy, right? Is like increasing that fluency. I think there's another that's the application of AI across basically everything that you do, from your recruiting tools all the way up through performance management, right? And I think there's a way that AI will touch every single one of these. And I think some of us are dipping our toes in this in some way. But I think I'm not sure that I've seen anyone really double down and have a super comprehensive or clear strategy on it. We, unsurprisingly, we're experimenting with a lot. So I'll give you one example. I don't know if you have a point of view on performance management, but for most, it's sort of a dreadful process that takes a disproportionate amount of time to kind of like get done. And a lot of companies actually do it multiple times a year, right? But one of the more painful parts of that process is actually like aggregating and summarizing a lot of information, whether it's like from various OKR docs or 360 reviews or what have you. And so this past year, my team implemented what we were calling Sprites GPT, which was basically a way to summarize all this information for both the employee that was writing their self review, but also for the manager to save like thousands of hours of time, right? And so, of course, this is like a very kind of we're very, very early in our journey, obviously, with this use case, but the more you can kind of test and learn how to apply some of the basics of AI, I think it's really kind of like opening the door to even more possibilities, right? And so we're experimenting. Time will tell and we will see, but we hope to become more sophisticated, not only as a company around AI, but as an HR organization as well.
If you get a chance, you should go check out our recent episode with the VP of DEI from Upwork. She
Yeah.
shared how they are using, oh, I think the tool's called Textio.
Yeah.
Yeah, Textio to help them with writing the
Removing
performance.
bias. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think they feed Textio all of the performance like review data from the last 4 or 5 years, and they did an analysis on the language that was used, like problematic language, things like that. Super interesting. Like I would have never even thought of doing that. So,
So crazy that that's
um,
possible.
yeah, you should definitely check that out. I know we have a little bit more time. I guess my last question for you, like any big predictions for the future of work? Like I think the way that we asked this question to Nick Bloom was, uh, like, what are some of your crazy or like radical ideas?
I love this question. Something that I think about a lot as an HR leader is the concept of attrition and how we're like, no, it's so bad. Don't leave us ever. But in fact, it's completely natural and it's totally inevitable. And our roles as leaders are really to enable careers for the long term. They're not just to keep a certain person in their seat for as long as humanly possible. That's not reasonable, right? To this end, I created this program called CPO in Residence, so Chief People Officer in Residence. It's an 18 to 24-month program. It has rotations across different functions in HR, so HR business partner, total rewards and executive comp, executive recruiting, etc. There's like a job shadowing element. There's a board and external CHRO mentorship and a formal education component, right? There's a lot of these CHRO certificates at places like Cornell, and I think now UCal Berkeley has one. But the offboarding actually is externally to a CPO job, right? And at first, and even still, I get a lot of pushback like, why would we invest so much time just to offboard someone? And it's like, well, because you're missing the point, right? Our job as leaders are actually to develop the next generation of leaders, period. Not the next generation for Dropbox HR or even Dropbox as a company, but just more broadly. And I know no one, like, maybe I'm off on my own island on this thing, but I really firmly believe that great leaders, right? They invest in the growth of other great leaders. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that our entire career is going to be limited to one specific place, right? So I guess that would be kind of like the radical idea.
I feel like every company should have, or sorry, every department should have something similar to that. Like, I was a marketer. It would have been awesome if my company had something called the CMO in Residence program. Like, sign me up. I would have signed up for that immediately. So, love that idea.
Think about all the radical fans and buyers of your products you would have, or like sources of talent and referrals that you would get if you just embrace this a little more. So I love the notion of this program. How long
Absolutely.
is it?
How long is it? It's 18 to 24 months.
Okay.
Yeah, so it just kind of depends, but yeah, I think If at the end of the day, Dropbox ends up being a place where people say, oh, wow, that's a place where there are a ton of really awesome people leaders, or a ton of people have left to become CPOs. That's amazing. That does amazing things for our brand. Everyone on the Dropbox HR team's brand increases, right? If that's the meme. So, it's positive for everyone.
You're giving me a great idea, and I might cut this out, but maybe we'll have to follow up with you because we've been tinkering with like similar ideas for the modern people leader and like how do we advance the function of HR, and we never can quite come up with the right answer. And maybe it's helping CHRO CPOs like you create like a CPO in residence program. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, what would be even more amazing is if there was a person that did a stint at like four different companies, right? So widen the aperture even
Oh my God.
further. So it's not just at Dropbox, but let's say you pick four sponsors and you pick an amazing person to put through, and then think about all like the networks that these collective four CHROs would have and what the offboarding of this person might look like and where they would go. I mean, it would be amazing.
Well, there's another idea for us to think about, Stephen.
Yeah. We're preparing for our goal planning, and one of my notes in our we do it all asynchronously. And one of my notes was we need to focus on less ideas and more execution. But here we are. It's a good problem to have because there's just so much need for help in the HR and people leader community. I feel like we're in a good position with respect to our mission of improving the lives of millions of employees through helping to foster and develop better people leaders. And that's essentially like why we do what we're doing. And so that's a good place to be when you have a lot of ideas. So now it's just a matter of like putting them into making them a reality. And so with that said, I think this is a good point to turn the corner. It happens every conversation. I'm always sad to do it, but otherwise we'll keep going on for hours. So
Yes.
we have our next section, we have a few more questions and then one last tradition and we'll wrap things up.
Great.
And so now we're entering the part of our show that we call rapid fire questions. And so if you're ready, let's go ahead and jump
Ready.
into the first
Let's do
question.
it.
Awesome. If you could go back in time and talk to a 22-year-old you, what career advice would you give yourself and why?
Yes. Great question. I would say there are no wrong turns in a career journey, and failures are really a growth accelerant, right? You learn far more from making mistakes or falling on your face than you do from stumbling into good luck. And as you grow as a leader and you're asked to give advice, more often than not, you tell stories about your shortcomings or failures, right? Not your easy wins or successes. Plus, it just makes for better storytelling.
Yeah, I feel like those are always the best stories.
Yeah.
All right, next question. If you could fix any HR or people problem with a magic wand, what would it be and why?
I think so. You touched on this earlier, Stephen. I would love to just like stop talking about work-life balance. The notion that these two things are equal is so preposterous, right? And I think you had a great term for this. My term is work-life harmony, right? The blending of our lives and what we choose as our life's work in a way that's realistic and enables prioritizing the right things at the right time.
I like harmony better. Mine was work-life integration.
Oh,
That's
that's a
like
good one
super
too.
mechanical. Like, harmony's better. Harmony's better. And so next question.
Yes.
When you look around the corner to the end of 2024 and beyond, what do you see coming next for the future of work?
Yeah, so we touched about this a little bit earlier, but I think it's going to be the acceleration of leveraging AI in the workforce, right, across every function. So in HR, but also every team, every function, every company, like it's happening.
And last rapid fire question. Who
Yes.
should we bring on to the show next?
Okay, so does this person have to be a head of HR or in the HR space?
No?
Okay, so if I had my wish and could send somebody your way, it would be Craig Federighi. He oversees software development at Apple. I used to support his team as an HR business partner like 10 years ago, and he has so many incredible superpowers, but one is this sort of notion of altitude metering so he can see out like 10 years. But he's an incredible engineer, maybe the best on the entire whatever 4,000 person team. He can actually get into lines of code. So that's superpower one. And two is he was notorious for giving presentations where each slide would have only one word or one picture, and his presentation would be completely captivating. It's my number one professional goal, actually, to ever do a presentation that has one word per slide. Still haven't done it, but he would be a person I would recommend. I just think he is a brilliant industry luminary and would be amazing on your show. I don't know if people
Oh
at
my,
Apple are allowed to actually do things like this, so it might not be the right recommendation.
but I love it because we continue to get stretched in terms of like what we think is like the next level of guests we could have. And I love it. I love it. That's a great recommendation. And so, we'll start working on the manifestation of that. And there probably are some barriers, but you never know. You never know. So oh my God, this has been such a fun conversation, Melanie. I told you this would be a lot of fun. Hopefully you've enjoyed it as well. We have one last tradition before we wrap up. We call it one word or phrase close. So it can be a word or a few words that we all respond with just as we look back at the last hour and change of time that we spent together, a way of closing things up. And we prefer for our guests to go first.
Okay, so I think I would say flexibility.
You
Daniel?
got one, Steven?
I do. I'm going to go with harmony.
I'm gonna say experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Lovely.
Love it.
Well, we did it. Thank you so much for joining us, Melanie. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for bearing with us and some of our technical hiccups. This was such a fun episode. Thank you.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much for having me. This is great. Would love to keep in touch. If you are ever in New York again, please do let me know.
We definitely will.
Okay.
For sure.
Awesome.
Bye, Melanie.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Modern People Leader. We really, really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating. It would mean the world to us. And connect with us on LinkedIn. We want to know what you think about the show, and you can find links to both of our profiles in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and see you on the next episode.